Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Cooperative Monitoring Center at Sandia National Labs, I want to welcome you to our second virtual CMC seminar speakers event, addressing the future of scientific collaboration to advance national security. My name is Mallory Stewart, and I'm the director of the CMC. We are very excited to hear from today's speaker. But first, let me share a few ground rules. First, please mute your mics during this presentation to avoid accidental interruptions of our fabulous speaker. Second, if you have a question for the speaker, you can put it in the chat box or email it to cmc@sandia.gov. Adam will try to get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A section after the presentation. Third, if the Skype meeting fails, which it could do, today has been an interesting day for Skype connectivity, or you cannot hear the speaker, please exit the meeting and re-log in. And our apologies in advance if there are any technological challenges. It's just the way it goes these days. Fourth, this is an unclassified event. Please keep any submitted questions unclassified. And now I was hoping to turn it over to Dr. Adam Williams to introduce our speaker and talk about today's event. And I'm not sure if he's yet on. Let me see. Oh, yeah, there he is. Great. Adam, let's see if your microphone and camera work. Shall we give it a go?
Hello?
We hear you. Yep, thank you.
Oh, you can? Oh, good. Okay, let me turn my volume up so I can hear you better. Excellent. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Is it my turn to introduce Mallory?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you and welcome again, everyone. Thank you for your patience with the joys of telecommuting. My name is Adam Williams, and I am a principal R&D systems engineer here at Sandia's Center for Global Security and Cooperation. At Sandia, I lead a variety of projects as a systems theoretic analysis expert for numerous customers around our complex. To reiterate to do a little bit of introduction for today's talk, I want to elaborate a little bit on what Mallory said in terms of the CMC. So founded in 1994, the Cooperative Monitoring Center at Sandia National Laboratories was created to demonstrate how technological cooperation can build trust and provide a forum where experts can collaborate on scientific solutions to international security problems. For more than 25 years, hosted and has worked with such experts from around the world to promote peace and security through science diplomacy. This year, the CMC has recommitted itself to promoting the importance of science-driven collaboration for international peace and stability in the 21st century. Today, the CMC celebrates the scientists and experts that are thinking across boundaries and beyond traditional problem sets to apply cutting-edge science, engineering, and technology to strengthen international security. Dr. Ghena Alhanaee's data-driven research aims to help nations prepare for potentially catastrophic events, relying on scientific solutions to security problems. Today, she will be presenting her talk titled Interdependency of the Water, Oil, Nuclear Industries in the Persian Arabian Gulf, Understanding Risk and Improving Prevention and Preparation of Disasters. Her model seeks to better understand the risk relationship between seemingly minor incidents and their potential to create devastating consequences. She earned her PhD this past summer from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Southern California. Her research focuses on environmental sustainability, energy resources, water and food security, specifically in the Persian and Arabian Gulf. She has presented her work internationally from North America to Europe to the Middle East, and in 2019, she was named as one of MIT's Innovators Under 35 for the Middle East and North Africa region. Subsequently, this past year, she was named to MIT's Innovators Under 35 Award for the Global List. Ghena received her Master's of Science in Energy Resources Engineering also from Stanford, and her Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the Petroleum Institute in her hometown of Abu Dhabi, UAE. After this talk, I will gladly moderate a brief question and answer session with our distinguished speaker. Thank you again for joining us today, and it is my pleasure to yield the virtual microphone over to you, Ghena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adam, for the kind introduction. So as Adam mentioned, I'll be talking today about the interdependency of the water, oil, and nuclear industries in the Persian or Arabian Gulf. I always like to preface any presentation with the name of the Gulf and give a little bit of a background. So if you are on I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but if you are on the Iranian side of the Gulf, you refer to this body of water as the Persian Gulf. If you are on the other side of this body of water, where the Arab countries lie, you refer to this body of water as the Arabian Gulf. And so I'm from this side of the body of water, from Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. My PhD advisor, Dr. Najmuddin Mishkati, who I believe is joining us today, is actually from the other side of the water. And so for the sake of our research and for this presentation today, we'll simply be referring to this body of water as the Gulf. So whenever I'm mentioning the Gulf, I'm referring to this body of water. So it's surrounded by 8 countries, as can be seen on the map, and it's roughly 600 miles long at the longest point. And it has one small opening to the wider ocean, which is the Strait of Hormuz, about 35 miles wide. So it's a relatively small body of water. And to give you a perspective on size, this body of water in terms of area is roughly half the size of the state of California. So it's a very small body of water. So you might be thinking, why would we be concerned about this small body of water on the other side of the world? This small body of water is actually a very critical body of water, not just for this region, but also globally. It has global implications. And so looking at these 3 main industries, firstly, this region, the boom of oil put this region on the map. The oil industry is massive in this region. And so just looking at last year's data, roughly 1/3 of global oil was produced here in this small region in the Gulf. And about 15,000 tankers pass in and out every year to import and export oil. Now, with the boom of oil came an incredible, tremendous population growth. And this led the region to need to secure reliable water supplies. Now, because this region is a desert region, it's very dry, there aren't really options for water. Groundwater is minimal, it doesn't rain much. They had to turn towards desalination of the Gulf water to be able to secure these water supplies. As of this year in 2020, about 70% of global desalination capacity is right here in this Gulf. So most of the world's desalination capacity is in this small body of water. And that shows the significance and the dependence on the Gulf water for securing reliable water supplies. In fact, most of the Arab countries, over 90% of their water is coming from desalination of the Gulf water. So they really don't have any other option when it comes to their water. And then when we talk about the nuclear industry, this has been a trending topic over the last several years. In 2012, the first reactor became operational in Iran. And then just 2 months ago, the second reactor became operational in UAE. And projections put the region to having as many as 28 reactors by 2040. So what does this look like visually on the map? Just so we have an idea. These 2 green spots are the 2 reactors that are now operational as of this year. These 3 yellow ones in UAE are reactors that are under construction, and actually they're pretty much complete and should be becoming operational in the next year or so. The red dots that we have are reactors that are planned, and then the blue dots we have are under consideration. So it hasn't been officially confirmed, but these are under consideration. So this is what the spread of reactors look like in the region. And why is this important? Because these three industries working at such a large scale in this small body of water makes them inherently interdependent on each other. Whatever one industry is putting into the water is impacting the other two industries. If there's an incident at a reactor, or if there's an oil spill, for example, then that has implications for the desalination industry and vice versa. And so they are inherently interdependent on each other with their operations, with what they put out into the water and so on, due to this close proximity and cluster of location and sharing also the same resource of water. And then throw on top of that one more fact, which is as follows. Most of the surrounding countries only have a 2 to 3 day supply of water in the case of an emergency. So most of the countries, specifically the Arab side, only has about 48 hours to 72 hours of water supply. So now when we are talking about an incident occurring in the region, not only does it have implications for these three industries, but it has really serious implications for the main source of water for the surrounding population. And so this makes it even more critical to ensure the security and sustainability of this body of water, not just for the region, but also globally as well. And there are some other challenges in the region. One of them is that they are highly dependent on this body of water for their seafood as well. This is their main source of protein, seafood from the Gulf. This graph just shows a trend of the surrounding countries, and we can see a general upward trend of seafood. To give a perspective, in the US, the average person eats 7 kilograms of seafood in a year, while in UAE, it's 29 kilograms per year. So it's over 4 times that number compared to the average person in the US. So several of these countries are the highest seafood consumers in the world. And so again, an incident happening in the region could also potentially impact a main source of their food supplies as well. And then one other challenge is climate change. So this region is already one of the hottest regions in the world. And this is a paper from Nature Climate Change by Jeremy Powell that looked at the Gulf and projections of temperature change in the Gulf due to greenhouse gases. This first figure shows us historical data of the last 30 years and is basically the average of the highest temperatures in the last 30 years. The second figure shows if the countries were to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, what this would look like. And then this third figure is business as usual. So if they continued business as usual, this is what the temperature distribution would look like. So we can see that, and this is the temperature distribution by the end of the century. So by 2100, these are the predictions. And we see that there's this dark purple region, and that includes some of the surrounding cities in the Gulf, and this represents 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. This number is very critical. This 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature is the temperature at the limit of human survivability. So a fit human cannot survive for several hours at this level of temperature, 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. So it's a very critical number. And so Jeremy Powell's research found that before the end of the century, so in the next 60, 70 years, several of the surrounding countries will actually hit this critical temperature, 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. And again, that has implications because as it gets hotter, more energy is needed, more water is needed, and so on. So that also plays a very critical role as to these three industries. So these are some of the challenges in the region. For the scope of our research, we focused on specifically these three industries because we wanted to focus on the incidents that are more sudden and not as creeping of an effect. So those incidents that can occur that could be sudden and need immediate attention and immediate response. So we looked at specifically these three industries to understand the relationships between these three industries, because this body of water is unique, having this level of activity of these three major industries in such close proximity with each other. And so we wanted to understand the relationships between these three industries and understand the links. For example, if an oil spill happens, how does that impact a desalination plant close by, and so on. The links that exist due to this close proximity, and therefore also to be able to then implement ways to manage this risk or mitigate this risk and plan ahead in the case of an incident. And so what did we do? We looked at internal events and external events. Internal events are events that are occurring in one of the industries, but then their effects propagate into another industry. So for example, an oil spill in the region could propagate and then impact desalination plants nearby. And then an external event is one that is not triggered by one of these industries, but is triggered firstly by an external event occurring, such as a natural disaster occurring, whether it's an earthquake, a tsunami, or some sort of external event that occurs and then has a direct impact on more than one of these industries. So an earthquake that impacts an oil industry, at the same time it impacts a reactor in the region. So how do we respond in this situation when we have two major industries that are now in critical condition? How do we plan ahead? How do we respond? In this case? And so we looked at these incidents and we categorized them into 8 main categories. The first one being natural disaster, as we just discussed, like an earthquake or tsunami in the region. The second one being government and regulation, so meaning the laws and regulations that are in place that have an effect on how the industries operate. Identical components are those components that more than one industry uses, and therefore they're susceptible to the same types of failure, so industries can learn from each other. Human is a human error that occurs in an industry or more than one industry. And a shared connection is a connection such as electric power or a pipeline that is shared by more than one industry. An economic event, one that impacts the economy of the country or the region. We could look at the pandemic, for example, as one that could have an impact on more than one industry. Physical proximity is due to the proximity of more than one plant or reactor close to each other. For example, if an offshore oil plant has an explosion and there's a desalination plant close by, that could have an impact just because of the proximity of the two. And then organizational is the organizational structure of these industries. So we have these 8 main categories, and then each one of them has subcategories and so on. I won't go into all the subcategories and the details, but this is the general idea of how we looked at events. And then we had a limitation. So we wanted to now look at data of historical events that occurred to be able to learn from those past events and understand different causes that contributed to these past events. Now, when it came to data in the Gulf, this is where we faced a limitation. So the Gulf, the region, is very private about their data. And so we couldn't access data. We didn't have public access to data of incidents that occur in the Gulf. And so to be able to overcome this limitation, what we did is we looked at where we could get publicly accessible data, and that was in the US. So when it came to oil incidents, specifically offshore oil plants, because that was what we were interested in looking at, we looked at data from the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. And they have reports of the offshore plants around the US, and they have their reports publicly accessible of different incidents that occur at these plants, what happened, how much was spent, what was spilled, and so on, all the different details, what triggered it, what caused, what were the identified factors, and so on. So we looked at those. And then for the desalination industry, we didn't look at the incidents at desalination plants because we considered desalination plants to be more of a victim as to what the other 2 industries are putting in. And then the nuclear industry, we looked at the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, specifically the licensee event reports that they have publicly available, so that we could look at the different incidents that occur and the different causes and so on. And we can consider those, what we did with the nuclear reports actually is we limited it to pressurized water reactors because that is the technology that is being introduced in the Gulf. So we just looked at the technology that is the same as the Gulf to be able to apply the data to the Gulf, because the same systems are susceptible to the same types of failures and so on. So to be able to apply that to the Gulf region. And so we looked at these different incidents, these different reports at both offshore oil plants, nuclear reactors here in the US. And then we developed different risk assessment, Bayesian belief networks, and analysis to understand different relationships between different factors of events. So this is just an example. For example, at the bottom, we see here safety supervision. One of the things that came up was the issue of safety supervision. So one of the things that we looked at was what contributes, for example, to safety supervision, fatigue at the workplace, job repetition, leadership enforcement, all the different things that the different incident reports that we evaluated, which was a couple of thousand reports and incidents that we looked at. So we categorized them to identify what was contributing to these different factors, to understand then what relationships these factors have on each other and how we can toggle one to improve another and so on, to understand what are the best factors to toggle and improve and work on and so on. And then this is just a snapshot. Again, I won't go into too much of the technical details, but this is just a snapshot of the framework and our methodology for how to work. So we looked at reports at each industry, so at offshore oil plants and at nuclear reactors. But now we want to link everything together because these industries are working independently, but we want a way to link them all together. So what this shows us is basically each circle represents each industry. This is desalination, this is nuclear industry, this is the oil industry. And what we are able to do, for example, is say, okay, if we look at this orange rectangle here, this represents an external event occurring. So say, for example, an earthquake occurred in the region. We basically plug in, okay, there's this earthquake, it's of this magnitude. We want to know what happens now to each industry if such an incident occurred. So if this earthquake occurred, we for example, identify, okay, event C now occurs in the desalination industry. And this event C, how does it propagate within the desalination industry? What components does it impact? What safety systems are impacted? What resources are now needed? And so on. And then that same external event, what does that look like for the nuclear industry, for example? And say, for example, it triggers event A in the nuclear industry, and again, how does that propagate within a specific reactor or so on? What components are susceptible? Where are our vulnerable points in this reactor and so on? And then the same thing for the oil industry. So we were able to basically put in data and then see how things propagate within different industries. Same thing if we look, for example, here, this SC red diamond in the center shows us a shared connection, for example. So if we have a shared, for example, offsite power that they all share and we want to evaluate this, we can then plug it in and then look at how this impacts the oil industry, how this impacts the reactor that it's connected to, how it impacts the desalination plant that it's connected to, and so on. So we can then link them all together and understand the relationships and understand how an event that occurs impacts these industries in different ways, and therefore be proactive and be able to have a plan in place before an incident occurs. So we have a plan, for example, if such an earthquake occurs, we already have identified the vulnerable components, things maybe we need to improve, things we need to respond to quickly when such an incident occurs, and how to then manage the resources when we have more than one industry impacted in such an event. And then after connecting these three industries together, we want to also ideally connect all the countries together. And so this can be done in different ways. This is just an example of how this can be done. So pretty much now each country has their industries linked, so each of their respective nuclear, oil, and desalination industries linked, but we also want a way where the countries are also linked. So the countries are also sharing data and communicating with each other and having that link of communication with each other. And ideally, having some sort of regulator that ultimately regulates these 8 countries and puts in place the decisions, for example, the laws, the regulations, the restrictions on what the countries can put out into the water, and so on, the different regulations in place to control the operations of the nuclear reactors, the offshore oil plants, desalination plants, and so on, and have a unified system where data is shared collectively. So these different countries, their different industries, they're able to share the relevant data and then continuously be updating this data, continuously be learning from this data, and then passing it basically back and forth and improving the system to have those risk mitigation practices, strategies, response mechanisms in place before incidents occur, so that everyone is on the same page basically and already have the response strategies in place collectively. Because what any country puts into the water obviously is not limited to that country, but has potential impacts on all the surrounding countries as well. And so this is the stage where we are at, bringing this from data to policymakers. So using data and engineering and technical background to then inform policy decisions and create a regional framework for multi-industry collaboration, and to be able to then put in place a unified risk management and mitigation practice to respond collectively when an incident occurs, and to have these strategies in place before an incident occurs and not at the moment reacting when an incident occurs. So that brings me to the end. I tried to stay away from too much of a technical information, but I'm happy to answer any technical questions or otherwise. So thank you so much.
Take the right given to me as the moderator and ask the first question. So to what extent have you been able to share your insights with regional stakeholders, and how have they received them?
So because I'm from UAE was the easiest for me to get in touch with and communicate, because it's because it's right. Someone from their country reaching out to them. So I have been able to make the connection with the oil industry and the nuclear industry and the environmental agency in UAE, and they have been receptive and open to discussion and talking, but of course it's a whole other step to actually put things in place and get things implemented. But we have been able to make those first initial steps of opening the room for discussion.
Excellent.
I think can you hear me?
No? All right, hold on. Ay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, my apologies. Hooray for technology. Ghena, can you see the chat box?
Yes, I just opened it.
Okay, so I will I will reread the question, but I'll paste it in the chat as well. In your research, did you find it difficult to communicate specific data, models, or theories to non-engineering professionals?
Short answer is yes. It's always difficult to, talk too technical about it. So conversations have always I mean, had to be more focused on, things like data that is very clear data. For example, okay, we have a 2 to 3 day supply of water in the case of an emergency. I mean, everyone can understand that. And things like that. So it's more of the key points and highlighting why it's important as opposed to what was actually done, the technical part of it. If that makes sense, yeah. So that's the
No, absolutely. And you, in part, you answered the other question that was emailed in earlier. But again, one of the primary objectives of the CMC is to try to achieve kind of these diplomatic type relationships based on technical solutions to challenging problems. And so, that particular challenge of trying to clearly communicate kind of fairly technical or rigorous information is a challenge that we know very well, and just always curious to gain tips and hints from other colleagues. Okay, so there was one more question in the chat box here. Let me see. Here we go. Excuse me. What emergency response technical analysis capabilities exist in each of the 8 countries, and what is the current nature of communication across those groups?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the main issues is, the politics in the region. So it's, not all the countries are on speaking terms, unfortunately. You have UAE and Saudi Arabia, for example, who have cut Qatar off, who is their neighbor, and Saudi Arabia shares a border with Qatar, but they're not on speaking terms right now. And then, of course, you have this side of the water and then the other side of the water. Of course, they can't even agree on the name of the water, so you can kind of get an idea of the relations that exist there. So there is cooperation and communication amongst some of the countries, but it's more of in clusters. And so it's not a unified, there isn't really a unified emergency response plan or unified technical analysis that is being done in the region. So it's really each country has their environmental agency, for example, that goes out and tests the water and has different things that they're doing. But again, it's really each country on its own. And to some extent, 1 or 2 countries cluster together and share information and technical capabilities, but it's pretty limited. And it's also hard to know what extent, because again, a lot of it is private. So it's hard to also know to what extent the level of technical analysis that is taking place exists. Yeah.
Right. So a natural follow-on question is, what do you think the appetite is for additional collaboration amongst the emergency response capabilities in the region?
I think, on an individual country basis, they're all interested in some sort of, emergency response plan, because of course it benefits each of their countries. But the issue is getting past all the politics of the region and actually sitting down and having that communication, sitting down at the same table, having that conversation, putting politics aside and saying, okay, you know what, if something happens in this region, it impacts us all. We have to come together and just put everything else aside, because if an incident happens, we're all impacted. It's like with the pandemic, how the pandemic occurred. And when something happens, it doesn't know the country's border, right? It just seeps and it spreads. So to some extent, yeah, it needs to happen, but it's a difficult, it's a challenge.
Right. There's the Dr. Mishkati coming out. All right. Yep. And honestly, that was probably an unfair question, because if that was an easy answer, then we would probably be doing it right now. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Okay. A couple more questions here in the box. I'm going to take the most recent one because it seems germane to what we were just talking about. So the comment is, perhaps it will take a major incident to bring countries together for the first time, which, well, you're the speaker. I will let you comment.
Yes. That's the fear, right? That it's only going to happen when an incident occurs. And I mean, will it even happen when an incident occurs? Because I mean, if we look at let's just take a look at 2020, and like this pandemic occurred, and I mean, people were still operating in clusters. So I don't even know if an incident occurring will be the step that brings the countries together for the first time.
That's an interesting response. I'm not sure, right? I can see a subset of the participants. I'm not sure of all of their relative experiences in engaging with different countries in the Middle East, but you know, the statement you just made that perhaps even a major industrial accident would not be enough to overcome regional politics matches my experience, and hopefully is very telling, right, to folks who don't have that experience in the region. Okay, a couple other questions here. Oh, wow, lots of other questions. Let me try to take them in order. All right, so an earlier question is, given the Gulf Cooperation Council grid, did you find any cooperation exist across the GCC between the same industries?
Yeah, this is a good question. So the GCC, there is some sharing of grid and electric power. Just to give a bit of a background, so some countries are able to send power to each other, for example. The GCC is basically a formation of the Arab countries, right? So it's kind of like half the water side. But also within the GCC, I mean, for the last several years, there have been it's slowly breaking apart, basically, to put it nicely. I mean, so for example, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar are all part of the GCC, right? But now UAE and Saudi Arabia have a blockade against Qatar, which initially, I mean, people thought would go on just for a few weeks, just to pressure them into some decisions, and now it's been years where they're not on talking terms. They don't fly to each other's countries. There's all these additional limitations. So even with the GCC, it's slowly, I mean, it's even that is not unified. Is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. So pivoting just slightly, and this is more on some of the implications of your work, but in your research, did you find an issue that was more pressing than others?
Definitely. I mean, the main issue, and which is what we focused on, is whether a large scale, for example, an oil incident like BP Deepwater Horizon scale, or a nuclear incident like Fukushima scale, those are the ones that are most concerning. If that happens in the region, I mean, a 2 to 3 day supply of water, what happens? Because, I mean, look at Fukushima, we're hitting the 10-year mark, right? 10-year anniversary in March 2021. And I mean, they're hitting headlines now because they have thousands of storage tanks that they are stored over 1 million metric tons of water, and they're now thinking of discharging it out into the water, right? What happens in the Gulf when that isn't even an option? I mean, yeah.
So, again, I will take the liberty for a follow-on. Have you, in your colleagues at USC, have you done any thinking regarding some of those cascading effects? So, as you indicated, right, there would be kind of an initiating event, let's say an earthquake, that would cause some industrial incident that impacts the Gulf. Because of the impact on the Gulf, there's a limitation, or there would then be, right, kind of a run on water based on this limited water supply. But, what happens on day 4 if there's only 3 days of water? Which I know is a much bigger question, but I was just wondering if your team has done any thinking on that.
Yeah, we didn't specifically look at like what the implications after, because we were more focused on sort of the other side of it, of preventing that occurring from the beginning. But this, I mean, that is important work to know, and that's a big area for research and analysis, like to know really, yeah, what happened? Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, where are we now? I mean,
Right.
where do we get our water from? What's the plan? Yeah.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Lots more questions coming in. This is fun. It would be much better if we were in person, but we're doing the best we can virtually. Thank you for your help here. All right, question here, somewhat related. Did Fukushima change the risk calculus for countries in this region for putting such critical infrastructure, for example, for desalination, near nuclear reactors?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, so some of the countries, when Fukushima happened, they canceled their nuclear plans. Kuwait is one of them. Kuwait has gone back and forth. So once Fukushima happened, Kuwait, they were planning for one reactor and they were in discussions with different countries and so on, and they immediately said, no, thank you, we don't want this. So it did alter, even Saudi Arabia had some plans change. UAE had already commenced with their plans. At that point, that didn't change. So there was I don't know if there was necessarily change in where they were located near desalination plants versus whether it was just a should we do it or should we not kind of question. So I don't really have the answer about did they actually decide to change locations because of desalination plants, whether that played a role. I'm not sure about that part of it.
Great response. And just as a personal anecdote, so I was actually in Abu Dhabi when Fukushima happened. Teaching what is now known as the Genie Fundamentals course. And so obviously that drastically shifted our conversation. But what I saw in terms of a national Emirati response was the opportunity to kind of increase the seriousness with which they undertook each part of their job. Mm-hmm. So the participants in my course who were part of the regulator, right, the importance of making sure that they had clear, robust, comprehensive regulations was kind of codified and reiterated by the Fukushima tragedy. So it did, and you're absolutely right, Ghena. There were several countries who were kind of inching their way towards maybe wanting nuclear, and Fukushima happened, and then it was kind of a hard reset. But the UAE, essentially stood firm and just kind of doubled down and said, we know this is beneficial. We know there are some risks, but we're going to meet those. We're going to take those risks as opportunities to improve for improvement.
Exactly.
All righty, moving on down here. Another question is, did you find some common level of safety standards across the industries in each of the countries, or was there significant difference in the accepted safety standards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, because of the limitation on data and because we couldn't specifically look at the data of each country and each of their industries, I don't actually have an answer to what to the differences basically in the standards, because also again that is, I mean, it's kept private, so I don't have that information yet.
Okay. So let me see if I can slightly reword it, because it's an right. So if you think back to the slide that you had where you had the Venn diagram for nuclear, desal, and then oil and gas for each of the countries, and then each country was connected, correct? Right. So there's and again, this may be just food for thought or just an interesting set of connections, but there's a question of kind of country to country, how consistent or are there minimum standards just in general, but then you could even pick out individual industries. You could say the oil and gas industry in the Middle East, right? Just from each of the countries, how consistent are those safety standards or regulations or what have you, and kind of evaluating that level, again, assuming you get access to the data, but asking those two different questions may help identify opportunities to build, right, this regional consensus or the different mechanisms for creating more of a regional network for cooperation.
Yeah, and that's really important. That's why, we view it as important that there's some unified regulator that sets these standards that now all these industries need to follow. There's some sort of review process. There's some sort of making sure that everyone's on the same level of standards of safety.
Excellent. All right, looks like we have one more question here thus far. So given the infancy of the nuclear industry in the region, is that an opportunity space for building this technical and emergency response cooperation mechanism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, I mean, simple answer, I think yes. I think actually the nuclear industry in the UAE has been the most open to discussion. And I think it's because it's new. They're still, they're still working through things, so there's still room to make changes. But for example, if you look at the oil and gas industry, they've been operating for decades now. So I mean, their mindset is we're set, we're functioning, nothing needs to change. I mean, why change something that is working well? And I think given the infancy of the nuclear industry, it's a good opportunity to try to make some of these some of these mechanisms in place now, since it's new.
Right.
And I also think the nuclear industry also they're very concerned about safety, and so they're much more open to discussions of safety and security and as well.
Interesting. So this last question seems very similar to a longtime CMC project that we affectionately known as RNCC. So radiation. I'm going to get this wrong, of course, now that I think about it. I think it's radiation measurement cross collaboration. And the idea, and I believe it's still a regional network of technical experts that meet every year, but ostensibly the argument was very similar to the one you've made, Ghena, which is any incident at a facility with nuclear material or radiological material in this region, because it's geographically close, affects everybody. Therefore, there would be a benefit in having more technical capability and expertise in monitoring for certain signals, right? Certain radiological isotope measurements. And so what that initiated was essentially a 10 or 12-year program that involved using the objective technical skill of taking radiation measurements from environmental samples, but building a cadre of regional experts who coordinate and collaborate kind of routinely to share data and basically calibrate their machines based off what other people are measuring. Mm-hmm. So a fairly low level version of this larger technical regional exchange, but it seems to me that's a version of that could be based on some of your work, particularly to the extent that folks kind of understand your technical approach to providing objective solutions to a very real potential problem.
Yes.
There you go. Amir corrected me. Radiation measurements cross calibration. I was close. All right. Looks like a couple more questions came in, and we have a few minutes, so let's go for it. Next question is there a way to build connectivity between oil and gas and water desalination by pursuing produced water? I don't quite understand that. Peter, can you rephrase? I'm going to go to the next one. This question says, has there been any discussion to create a governing body made up of members from all states to pursue a more cooperative approach to emergency response?
Again, I think it's mostly been in clusters, but not a regional response strategy so far. Yeah.
All right. And then for those who can see the chat, there's some information on the radiation measurements cross calibration project at the link that Amir put in the chat box. All right. Well, I'm going to pause for just one more second before I ask one closing question, and then we can wrap up. So I'll go ahead and ask you the question, Ghena, and give you a moment to think about it because it's kind of a big one. So, let me try this again. In a version of the future where you are in complete control,
Okay.
and you could institute, one or two specific kind of events or actionable items to move towards this regional cooperation, what would they be?
And the ideal situation is
Right.
getting everyone on the same table and just saying, okay, politics aside, we need to preserve this body of water. We are all heavily dependent on it, and putting in place something where both researchers, people with technical backgrounds, are at the same table, and policymakers, and making informed decisions as to the policies in that region to really protect that body of water and putting that in place. That's the ideal scenario, to have everyone from each country, same table, both technical and policymakers.
No, that's again, I tried to ask a near impossible question in a more manageable way, right?
Yes.
That's why I gave you this fictitious future. No, that's fantastic. And again, I thank you so much. I'm really pleased to see your work. I'm a big fan of Dr. Meshkati out there at USC, and he's been a longtime friend of both me personally, but also of our program here at Sandia. And so, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up to try to stay on time. At this point, a couple of things here. To our online audience, thank you so much for participating and bearing with the multiple technical difficulties. You can still submit questions, and to the extent possible, we can pass them on to Dr. Alhanaee, and she can respond if and when she chooses. But thank you again for being our speaker today. And according to my script, I'm supposed to hand it off to Mallory, but unfortunately, again, technical difficulties. So I'm going to take Mallory's spot. So I will do my best to not disappoint and, kind of flub it. But essentially, again, we want to thank you, Ghena, for your time here today and sharing your thoughts and experience. And again, to our audience for some really interesting questions. And I was pleased to see the technical content of this presentation be appreciated as much as just your ability to provide a nice kind of nuanced summary of many of the non-traditional dynamics and influences that impact real solutions in the Middle East. One of my favorite anecdotes, it actually has to do with the body of water, right? If you noticed, I just call it the Gulf, because I've been, in several uncomfortable situations where I called it by the wrong adjective in the wrong country.
Yes.
Very entertaining, very easy to do.
Yeah.
But
That's
with
that,
that's right.
Yeah.
And before we could conclude, I wanted to mention that you can find out more about CMC activities, ongoing work, and the future of our speaker series by visiting the website cmc.sandia.gov. And so with that, from all of us on the CMC team, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future CMC events. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you so much for the opportunity, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.